I saved $15,000 to surprise my parents with a Mediterranean cruise for their 40th anniversary. A week before, my brother's wife texted. They said they'd rather go with us. They deserve a real vacation. I quietly refunded the tickets. The morning of their flight, they found out their bags were lost, the reservation was canceled, and their credit card limit was dropped to $500, and later saving $15,000 wasn't easy. I cut back everywhere I could. I canceled subscriptions, skipped nights out, and took every double shift my boss threw at me. My friends joked that I had gone into a self-imposed hibernation. But I had a goal, and every dollar felt like a step closer. I even sold my prize, Les Paul, the one guitar I swore I'd never part with because it was the kind of gift you only get once. My parents' 40th wedding anniversary was coming up, and I wanted to do something special. Growing up, I'd heard them talk about their dream trip to the Mediterranean. My mom would light up when she talked about walking the streets of Santorini or sipping wine in Tuscany. They never had a real honeymoon, just a cheap road trip to Myrtle Beach because money was tight. They've always worked hard and sacrificed a lot. And I thought this cruise would be the perfect way to say thank you. I kept the plan under wraps, only letting my brother Mark in on the secret. Mark has always been the golden child of a solid career. A house in the suburbs. A wife who hosts the kind of dinner parties where you have to ask which fork to use. Jenna, his wife, has always been a little too much for me. She's the kind of person who double-checks spelling and group chats and brings up real estate prices at family dinners just to remind you that she's winning at life. A week before their anniversary, Jenna sent me a text. It was short and casual, like she was mentioning the weather. You said you'd rather go with us. They deserve a real vacation. I had to read it twice. At first, I thought she must have misunderstood something, that maybe she got her wires crossed. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like a deliberate move. She'd clearly talked to my parents, and somehow the trip I'd planned for them had turned into a group outing that I suddenly had no place in. I called Mark, hoping he'd clear things up, but he just sounded exhausted. He admitted that yes, their parents had hinted that they'd be more comfortable traveling with family. I could hear Jenna in the background, probably pacing around her spotless kitchen, feeding him lines about how it was only fair. My stomach churned as he went on. He said something about how Jenna had already started looking at nicer hotels and excursions, real luxury experiences, and how it would be perfect for all of them. The unspoken message was clear. My effort wasn't enough. My gift, my sacrifice wasn't enough. The next morning, I quietly returned the money for the tickets. The click of my mouse felt like pulling the trigger on something I hadn't fully thought through. But I did it anyway. I watched as the refunded amount hit my account, a lump sum that felt both liberating and deeply, bitterly disappointing. But I wasn't done. If they wanted a real vacation, I was going to make sure it was one they'd never forget. On the morning of their departure, my parents discovered that their suitcases had been lost. I had been careful, taking the time to call the airline and using the right keywords to trigger the automated red flags that would ensure their bags were misplaced at the transfer hub. Then there were the reservations, the ones I had spent months meticulously planning, canceled. It took a few nerve-wracking phone calls, some creative acting, and a few strategically placed complaints about fraudulent activity to make sure those bookings disappeared into thin air. And then the final touch, their primary credit card, the one they probably intended to use for the entire trip, mysteriously had its limit reduced to $500. I knew exactly which bank they used, and it turned out that a few innocent-sounding security concerns from a trusted family member could go a long way. They still had no idea what was going on. But I wasn't done. Not even close. My phone started buzzing the morning they landed. I let the calls go to voicemail at first, letting them pile up as I imagined my parents standing in the bustling chaos of the airport. Their luggage nowhere in sight. Their carefully planned itinerary unraveling before their eyes. I could practically hear my father's grumbling and my mother's sharp sighs. I finally answered the third call, keeping my voice casual. My dad's tone was sharp, the way it always gets when he's irritated but trying to keep it together. They had landed in Rome, only to find their luggage missing. The airline hadn't been very helpful, and my parents now faced the prospect of starting their dream vacation in the same wrinkled clothes they'd worn on the flight over. I played dumb, pretended to be surprised, and made sympathetic noises as he ranted. Then he mentioned that their hotel, the one I had carefully booked for them, complete with a private balcony overlooking the Tiber, had no record of their reservation. They had argued with the front desk for nearly an hour before giving up and finding a cheaper place to stay. When he mentioned their credit card limit, his voice trailed off, a mixture of confusion and disbelief. My mother had nearly burst into tears when her card was declined at the first restaurant they tried. The bank had assured them that the sudden reduction was a security measure, but my dad couldn't understand why it had happened at the worst possible time. He ended the call by muttering that this whole trip was turning into a disaster and that he hoped I'd never have to deal with this kind of stress. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing as I promised to check in with the airline on their behalf. That night, Jenna called. She went on about how chaotic everything had been, how their perfect itinerary had been ruined by unexpected problems, and how they'd had to downgrade to a 3-star hotel that barely had air conditioning. I could hear Mark in the background trying to calm her down, his voice tense. She ended with a tight, passive, aggressive little comment about how this was supposed to be a once-in-a-lifetime trip for my parents and how disappointed they were. But it was my mom's second call that really stung. She didn't even bother with small talk. She just jumped right in and said she couldn't believe how badly I had screwed up their anniversary gift. She kept repeating that I should have known better, that it was irresponsible and selfish, that I clearly hadn't thought things through. Selfish. I hung up without answering, my heart pounding. She had no idea what I had really done, but it still cut deep. For a moment, I almost regretted it. Almost. But then I thought about Jenna's smug little messages and my dad's endless lectures about responsibility and doing something real with my life. And the anger came back. They had no idea what was coming. 2 days later, I received a text message from Mark. It was short, just one line. "Bro, what the hell is going on?" I ignored it. By then, I had already set the next phase in motion. I knew my parents had planned to visit a few major cities along the Mediterranean, and I figured it wouldn't take much to throw their plans into chaos. First, I called the airline again, this time, dropping a few hints about suspicious activity on their frequent flyer account. Nothing major, just enough to flag their return tickets for possible fraud. I wanted them to feel the slow, grinding stress of a vacation falling apart piece by piece. Next, I logged into the online account for the private tour I had originally booked for them in Athens. I remembered how excited my mother had been to walk through the ruins of the Acropolis, to stand where the philosophers once debated and look out over the city. With a few clicks, I replaced their names with a random couple of tourists I found on an online travel forum, figuring it was a small price to pay for the chaos I was brewing. Then I went a step further. I found a way to temporarily disable their international phone plan. A trick I learned from a tech friend who once helped me get out of a gym membership contract until they noticed they'd be stuck relying on spotty Wi-Fi signals and overpriced data plans, further isolating them in a country where they barely spoke the language. That night, Mark called again. This time I picked up. He sounded tense, clearly caught between his parents' desperate complaints and Jenna's growing frustration. He said something about how they were struggling to find their way without a working GPS. How their hotel in Florence had mysteriously lost their reservation and how their card kept getting declined at random places. I could tell he suspected something, but he didn't press me directly. Instead, he asked if I had heard anything from the airline or the bank if I knew why this was happening. I just mumbled some vague reassurances about travel mix-ups and European bureaucracy before making an excuse to hang up. The next morning, my parents called me again. This time, they were furious. My dad accused me of being careless and botching their entire trip, and my mom chimed in about how I had ruined their one chance at a perfect vacation. She said she had never been more disappointed in me, that this was just another example of me not thinking things through. And then she said it again. Selfish. I sat there gripping my phone, feeling my jaw clench as she ranted. Selfish. As if I hadn't sacrificed 2 years of my life to make this trip possible for them. As if I hadn't put my own dreams on hold to give them something special. They had no idea how deep this went, how carefully I had planned every twist and turn of their unraveling vacation. But as I hung up the phone, I felt a flicker of doubt. The kind that creeps in when you realize you may have gone too far. That maybe, just maybe, you've crossed the line from which you can't come back. But it was too late to stop now. A few days later, the messages from Mark stopped. I figured Jenna had finally convinced him to go into full vacation mode. Or maybe he'd just given up trying to reach me. Either way, I took it as a victory. But then a surprise. A message from Jenna herself. It came late at night. A wall of carefully crafted text. Each line dripping with passive aggression. She wrote about the incredible stress my parents were under. How they had spent hours on the phone with customer service, trying to get their accounts straightened out and their reservations reinstated. She implied that I had clearly cut corners, that I had probably used some shady third-party sites to book their hotels, and that this whole mess was a result of my reckless and selfish planning. Selfish again. I threw my phone on the couch, anger pulsing in my temples. I had gone from being the black sheep of the family to their personal scapegoat, all for trying to do something nice. But fine, if they wanted to paint me as the bad guy, I take the role. I started small, using one of the many travel apps I had experimented with while planning their original trip. I changed their remaining restaurant reservations to the kind of tourist traps that would leave them overcharged and underwhelmed. I knew my mother was dying to try authentic Italian pasta in a quiet, hidden trattoria. Instead, they'd be crammed into a corner table at a noisy, overpriced tourist joint with English menus and watered-down wine. Next, I made a few calls to the local transportation companies they'd booked for their intercity transfers. It took some patience, but I was able to change their private car in a Maui to a much cheaper, less reliable bus service. I could just picture my father, red-faced and grumbling, trying to fit his 6-foot frame into a cramped seat next to a bunch of sweaty tourists. And then, just to twist the knife a little deeper, I had their prepaid museum passes accidentally revoked due to an alleged payment dispute. I even threw in a few fake complaints under their names just to make sure they'd get some extra scrutiny at the entrances. Felt good. Too good, maybe. But the thought of them stumbling through Europe, struggling to put their plans back together, kept me going. But then 2 days later, Mark called. He sounded different this time, more frustrated than worried. He said her parents had been calling him nonstop, asking if he knew what was going on, if he had somehow messed up their bookings. He admitted that Jenna had been crying the night before, complaining that this trip had become a nightmare and that they might never get the chance to do something like this again. He said something that surprised me. He said our parents had started fighting real deep old marriage, kind of fighting the kind they hadn't had in years. They were snapping at each other over little things, turning every little inconvenience into a personal attack. He said he hadn't seen them like that since we were kids. For a second, I felt a pang of guilt. Not enough to stop me, but enough to make me hesitate. I had wanted to ruin their trip, to teach them a lesson about taking me for granted, but I hadn't expected to crack the foundation of their relationship. Mark sighed, his voice sounding more defeated than angry. He said he wasn't sure what was going on, but he had a bad feeling about the whole thing. He ended the call by telling me to be careful, that I was messing with something I didn't fully understand. I sat there for a long time after we hung up, the phone warm in my hand, my pulse still racing. Maybe he was right. But then I thought about that first text from Jenna about how they had taken my gift and twisted it into something ugly, and the anger flared up again, drowning out the doubt. I wasn't done yet. The next morning, I woke up to a long email from Mark. It was a rant masquerading as a plea for sanity. He wrote about how our parents had barely spoken to each other on the train from Florence to Venice, how they had fought over something as trivial as a misfoto Opalto bridge, and how the stress was getting to everyone. But the part that really caught my attention was when he mentioned Jenna. He said she had cried again, this time after a ruined dinner at a supposedly authentic Italian restaurant that turned out to be a tourist trap. He said she had blamed him for letting the whole trip fall apart, that he should have stepped up and taken control, that she felt abandoned. I could hear his frustration in every line, the cracks in his perfect suburban life beginning to show. He admitted that they had argued late into the night, that she had even suggested cutting the trip short and returning to the States early. For a second, I felt a rush of satisfaction. I had managed to hit them where it hurt to unravel not just their vacation, but their carefully curated lives. But then I got another call from my mother, and this time the tone was different. She wasn't angry. She just sounded tired, defeated in a way I hadn't heard before. She said something about how the trip had turned into a nightmare, that nothing was going right, that she felt like the universe was punishing her. Then she hit me with a line that stopped me cold. She said she felt like she had lost both of her sons. I sat there staring at my phone, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't expected this. I had been prepared for anger, for accusations, even for tears, but not for this quiet, weary sadness. For the first time, I wondered if I had gone too far. But then I remembered Jenna's smug little text that had started all this, and the resentment flared up again. I had sacrificed so much for this trip, and they had thrown it back in my face. They deserved to feel the sting of their own selfishness, to finally see the consequences of their constant unspoken favoritism. Still, the doubts crept in, small and insistent, like a slow leak in a sinking ship. The next day, I received another message from Mark. This time it was a single line. "We need to talk." I ignored it. But that night, I got a surprise call from an unknown number. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the reject button, but something made me pick up. It was Jenna. She wasn't screaming. She didn't even sound angry. She just asked in a shaky, exhausted voice if I knew what was happening, if I had anything to do with it. For a moment, I almost confessed. I almost told her about the reservations I had canceled, the cards I had sabotaged, the phone plans I had canceled. I almost came clean, hoping that maybe, just maybe, it would somehow make it less messy. But then she said something that made my blood run cold. She said that Mark had told her that he was thinking about taking a break when they got back, that he couldn't handle this version of her, the tightly wound, high-strung person she had become on this trip. She hung up on me before I could say anything, and for the first time I felt real tangible fear. I had planned to ruin a vacation to teach my parents a lesson. But now I was standing on the edge of something much darker, something that felt like it was spinning out of control, and I wasn't sure I wanted to stop it. Mark showed up at my apartment unannounced. It was late, well past the time when I usually expected visitors, and I almost didn't answer the door. But when I looked through the peephole and saw his familiar, tired face, I knew I couldn't avoid him any longer. He stepped inside without a word, dropping his duffel bag onto my couch. He looked rough, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, his hair a mess. It struck me that I had never seen him like this, not even back in college when we used to pull all-nighters before exams. For a long minute, we just stood there in the awkward silence. Finally, he ran a hand through his hair and let out a long, shaky breath. "Jenna is gone," he said, his voice flat. "She went to stay with her parents for a while." I felt my stomach twist. I had seen this coming, had even hoped for it in a twisted, vengeful kind of way, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way I hadn't anticipated. I offered him a beer and he took it, collapsing onto my couch like a man who had just run a marathon. We sat there. The only sounds, the soft hum of my fridge and the occasional creak of the old apartment building settling around us. I kept waiting for him to start yelling, to accuse me of ruining his life, to demand an explanation, but he just sat there staring into his drink. Finally, he spoke. "I'm done, man. I can't do this anymore. The house, the parties, the endless small talk with her parents, the pressure to be perfect. It's like I don't even recognize myself anymore." I stayed quiet, letting him talk because I knew this was the moment I had pushed him toward the breaking point I had engineered without fully understanding the damage it would do. He kept going, his words spilling out like a confession. He said Jenna had accused him of being a bad husband, of not caring enough, of failing to support her when the trip fell apart. She had blamed him for every misreservation, every awkward interaction, every tiny inconvenience. He said he had tried to comfort her, to remind her that things go wrong sometimes, that it's part of the adventure, but she had just snapped, saying he didn't understand, that he never would. Then he said something that hit me like a punch to the gut. She said, "I'm just like you." I felt my chest tighten, my breath catching in my throat. For a second, I thought he was about to confront me, to accuse me of sabotaging their trip, of setting this whole disaster in motion. But instead, he just took another long drink, his eyes fixed on the flickering neon sign outside my window. "I'm moving in with you for a while," he said, his tone resigned. "I need some space, a break." I'll figure things out eventually, but I can't go back to that house right now. I just nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. The full scope of what I had done slowly sinking in. I had gotten my revenge. I had shattered the perfect polished life my parents and Jenna had built, pulled apart the seams of their carefully constructed world. But now, sitting next to my broken, exhausted brother, I felt something I hadn't anticipated. Guilt. Real, raw, unshakable guilt. Because in my rush to punish my parents, to prove a point about being taken for granted, I had dragged Mark down with them. I had turned my only ally into collateral damage, and I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to fix it. As I sat there staring at the chipped paint on my apartment walls, I realized I had crossed a line I could never come back from. And for the first time, I wondered if I had really won or if I had just destroyed the one thing I actually cared about. Update. Alright, so I didn't expect this to blow up, but since a few people asked for an update, here it is. Mark has been crashing at my place for about 3 weeks now. It's been weird, like living with a ghost. He's quieter than I remember, more withdrawn. He spends a lot of time just sitting on my couch, scrolling through his phone, or staring blankly at the wall. I've tried to get him out, even took him to a bar last weekend, but he just drank a beer and barely said a word. But here's the thing I didn't see coming. My parents came back early. I thought they just limp through the rest of their ruined vacation and come home with some half-hearted smiles and fake stories about how magical the trip was. But no, they cut it short by a full week. They showed up at my apartment a few days ago, completely out of the blue. I came home from work to find my mom pacing in the hallway outside my door. My dad leaning against the wall with a look on his face I hadn't seen since I crashed his car in high school. They pushed their way inside as soon as I unlocked the door. And my mom immediately launched into a rant about how their dream trip had been a nightmare. How they felt cursed. How they had spent hours fighting hotels and airlines and banks just to get home. She went on and on about how they had lost control of everything, how it felt like the world was conspiring against them. My dad chimed in about how he had never felt so helpless, so out of his depth, like they were caught in some kind of twisted game. Mark came out of the guest room, his face pale, his eyes wide. I hadn't warned him they were coming, and the shock on his face was obvious. Then, in the midst of all the chaos, my mom said something that sent shivers down my spine. She said she thought they were being targeted. At first, I thought she was being dramatic, that she was still upset from all the travel chaos. But then she pulled out her phone and started scrolling through photos. She showed me a picture she had taken in Rome, just a random shot of a crowded piazza. But in the corner, half hidden behind a cluster of tourists, was a guy in a hoodie. His face turned just enough to see that he was holding up his phone as if taking a picture of her. Then she flipped to another picture, this one of Florence. Same guy, hoodie pulled up, phone in hand, lingering in the background, and another and another. I felt my blood run cold as she scrolled, photo after photo. The same shadowy figure lurking just around the edges, like a ghost haunting her every move. My dad muttered something about calling the police, about getting security cameras installed in their house, about how they were clearly being targeted by some kind of scam or stalker. I tried to play it cool to keep my face neutral, but my mind was racing because I had planned every twist and turn of their ruined vacation, but I had never sent anyone to follow them, which means someone else has, and I have no idea who it is. Should I keep it going? Maybe add another layer of mystery to really ratchet up the suspense. Just let me know how dark or twisted you want this to get, and I'll keep it going.